In the hidden chambers of Japan's palaces, behind screens of painted silk and sliding doors of paper, a world unfolded that few dared to name. It was a world of beauty and refinement, of poetry recited by candlelight, of dancers moving in silence across polished floors. But within this delicate setting lived a truth far darker, the life of the male concubine. They were chosen for their youth, for faces unmarked by age, and for beauty that could rival the painted courtesans of the pleasure districts. Taken from families by force or by promise of favor, they entered the courts not as servants of duty, but as possessions of desire. Their bodies became currency, their silence a shield, their obedience the price of survival. Behind the veils of elegance lay humiliation, nights spent in the chambers of powerful lords, mornings spent in fear of jealousy or punishment. To the world beyond the palace walls, their lives remained invisible, yet inside they were trapped in a theatre where every gesture belonged to another, every glance was measured, and every breath risked awakening cruelty. This is not the story of romance nor of honor, but of survival. A tale of how beauty, once seen as a blessing, became a curse. This is the horrific life of a male concubine in ancient Japan, a life hidden in shadows, preserved only in whispers and fragments of memory. Welcome to Scroll Historian. Here we unroll the forgotten pages of the past, stories of power, fear, and silence that history tried to hide. If you enjoy journeys into these hidden chapters, I invite you to subscribe, leave a like, and share your thoughts in the comments. Your voice helps keep history alive and ensures these stories reach others who seek to understand the shadows of the past. Now, let us begin. Behind the screens of power. In the great courts of Japan, power did not move only through armies or decrees. It flowed quietly through silken halls where beauty itself was a form of influence. Among the painted screens and carved wood of aristocratic palaces, men of authority kept not only wives and female courtesans, but also young boys whose lives were bound to serve as concubines. They were known for their elegance, for the softness of their features, for the youth that made them desirable. To the outside world, they were invisible, hidden behind the sliding doors of the shoji, shadows flickering in lamplight. Yet to the lords and nobles who ruled Japan's provinces, they were tokens of status, living ornaments to be displayed in private and kept in silence. For these men of power, the possession of such concubines was more than indulgence, it was a sign of supremacy. To take what others could not, to command beauty and obedience alike, became a performance of dominance. In the language of politics, the body of the concubine was another form of wealth, as telling as armor, land, or titles. The life behind those screens was refined in appearance but brutal in truth. A world of poetry, music, and incense cloaked the reality of control, and in that silence the concubine lived suspended between admiration and erasure, praised for beauty, yet denied existence as anything beyond it. Beauty, in the courts of ancient Japan, was a form of currency more persuasive than silver and more dangerous than steel. For young concubines, it was both their entrance and their sentence. Chosen for the delicacy of their features, their pale skin, their voices unbroken by age, they were paraded like treasures within the private chambers of their masters. The nobility valued them not only as companions but as reflections of their own prestige. To command the service of a boy admired for his beauty was to display one's power in silence, a message whispered through the walls of the palace. Each concubine became a mirror of his master's influence, a symbol to be envied, feared, and imitated. But such favor was fragile. A single mark of displeasure could shatter it. A glance held too long, a word spoken at the wrong time, or the suspicion of divided loyalty, all could turn admiration into punishment. In this world where appearances mattered above all, survival depended not on strength or wisdom, but on the perfection of silence and the mastery of obedience. Thus, behind the elegance of court rituals and the soft glow of lanterns, the life of the concubine was bound in chains unseen. Beauty, the very gift that had raised them into the palace, became the burden that trapped them there. The selection. The path into the palace did not begin with choice, it began with selection. Across towns and villages, whispers carried the knowledge of what the nobles desired: boys of tender age, faces untouched by hardship, movements graceful even in their innocence. To be noticed for such beauty could mean elevation into the splendor of the court, but also the loss of freedom that would never return. Families, driven by poverty or ambition, sometimes offered their sons willingly. A concubine in the service of a powerful lord might bring protection, or gifts or promises of favor. To others, it was a theft cloaked as honor, a child taken not for his future, but for his appearance, his youth turned into a currency that the family could neither refuse nor resist. Those chosen were led away from the rhythm of village life into the stillness of the palace gates. For them, childhood ended in that moment. The laughter of companions, the freedom of play, the voices of family, all gave way to the measured silence of polished floors, the rustle of silk, and the unspoken knowledge of what awaited behind closed screens. It was not the path of warriors, nor of scholars, nor even of servants. It was the path of possession, and once a boy was chosen, his name and his will mattered less than the perfection of his beauty. Within the palace, the chosen boys entered a world unlike anything they had known. The gates closed behind them, and with that sound, the life of their past dissolved. Servants stripped away their old garments and replaced them with robes of silk, heavy not with comfort, but with the weight of expectation. Their hair was combed, their skin powdered, their every movement adjusted to reflect the elegance demanded by courtly life. Elders and attendants began their instruction at once. They were taught to bow at precise angles, to walk with measured grace, to lower their eyes at the command of their masters. Their voices, once free to laugh or cry, became tools of performance, to recite poetry, to sing verses, to answer in tones that pleased those who listened. Each gesture was rehearsed, each mistake punished, until obedience became instinct. The boys soon learned that the palace was both sanctuary and prison. They walked among carved wood, painted screens, and gardens that seemed endless in their beauty. Yet all of it was a cage, gilded to conceal the bars. Their worth no longer belonged to themselves. It belonged to the gaze of others, to the desires of lords who saw not children, but ornaments of flesh and silence. And so, the process of selection was not simply choosing, it was transformation. What entered the palace as a boy left behind the freedom of his name and became instead an instrument of power, shaped to reflect the will of those who owned him, training and submission. The training of a concubine was as much about breaking the will as it was about teaching refinement. Within chambers lit by lanterns and perfumed with incense, the boys were drilled in the arts that pleased the nobility. They learned to play the koto and the flute, to recite verses with voices steady and sweet, to dance with gestures so precise that even their silence became performance. But behind the elegance of these lessons lay something harsher. Discipline was unyielding. A missed note, a stumble in posture, a glance held too long, all were met with reprimand, sometimes with blows, sometimes with punishments designed to remind them that beauty without obedience had no value. What mattered was not who they were, but how perfectly they could erase themselves in service to another's desire. The boys were instructed to move like shadows, present but unseen until called upon. They learnt to read the moods of their masters in the curve of a smile, in the flick of a hand, in the silence that filled a room. A single mistake could mean disgrace, and so fear became their constant tutor, weaving itself into every bow, every word, every step. For those who entered as concubines, training was not preparation for a future. It was erasure of the past. Each day they were shaped into something that was no longer themselves, but a reflection of the power they served. Silence became the truest lesson. In the palace, words could be weapons, and a boy who spoke out of turn risked not only punishment but ruin. The concubines learned quickly that their thoughts were not their own to share. Their smiles, their glances, even their breaths had to be measured, for each gesture might be misread by masters who demanded not honesty but perfection. They were reminded at every moment that they did not belong to themselves. The elders spoke of duty, but it was not the duty of a warrior or a scholar. It was the duty of submission, to exist only as long as they pleased those who commanded them. and so their silence was praised as wisdom, their obedience as virtue, their stillness as beauty. Within this quiet world, fear grew heavy. The boys saw what happened to those who resisted, some sent away in disgrace, others beaten into compliance, others simply gone, their absence left unexplained. Each disappearance was a warning whispered louder than any reprimand. Survival meant yielding, surrendering, becoming invisible until summoned. Thus the training was complete, not when they mastered poetry or dance, but when they mastered silence. When the boy who once laughed freely in the village could bow, smile faintly, and say nothing at all, then he had become what the palace desired, not a child, not a man, but an ornament of obedience. Knights of power. When night fell, the palace revealed its truest face. By day, the halls shimmered with ritual and refinement. Poetry recited, dances performed, voices kept low in respect. But in the silence after dusk, behind the paper screens and closed chambers, another world began. The young concubines were summoned, not as pupils of art or attendants of ceremony, but as bodies to be claimed, lords and daimios, who by daylight moved with the dignity of rulers, abandoned restraint when the lanterns dimmed. Power, sharpened in council halls, was now exercised in bedrooms, where command no longer wore the mask of governance but of appetite. For the boys, there was no refusal. To resist was to invite violence. To displease was to invite punishment. To falter was to risk banishment into disgrace. They moved as they had been trained, soft, silent, compliant, knowing that each gesture, each smile, each silence was measured against a master's will. And yet, even in this submission, danger lingered. The favor of one lord could spark the jealousy of another. A boy praised too openly might find himself marked for cruelty by rivals, envied not for his beauty but for the power it reflected. Desire became a battlefield, and the concubine its most fragile weapon. The knights were never equal. One evening might bring praise, gifts of silk or coins slipped into a trembling hand, whispers of favor that promised safety for a while. But the next could bring cruelty, jealousy erupting in violence, or a master's sudden rage leaving marks that no fabric could conceal. The concubine learned to live in uncertainty, each summons to the chamber heavy with dread. Their lives became divided between masks. By daylight, they were presented as refined attendants, skilled in music, poetry, and the art of graceful silence. By night, they were reduced to shadows, their training stripped away until nothing remained but their bodies and their obedience. The court admired their beauty, yet mocked their powerlessness, praising them in public even as they were humiliated in private. Rivalries festered in the darkness. One boy favored too often could become the target of others who sought to displace him by any means. Whispers carried poison sharper than steel, and alliances born of fear turned quickly into betrayals. The chambers that smelled of incense and wine also reeked of suspicion, where each glance might conceal envy, and each smile might mask the hope of another's fall. In such nights, power was pleasure, and pleasure was punishment. For the concubine, there was no distinction between the two, only survival, in a theatre where desire dictated their worth and fear measured their days, decay and abandonment. The beauty that had once secured their place in the palace was a fleeting shield. With each passing year, the faces of the concubines lost the softness that had made them desirable, and with that change came a slow and merciless decline. In a world that valued only youth, the smallest shadow of age became a sentence. Some were dismissed quietly, their silks exchanged for plain robes, their presence no longer required at feasts or chambers. They slipped from the inner halls to the margins of the palace, no longer ornaments of power but burdens to be forgotten. Others were cast out entirely, their years of service rewarded with nothing more than silence and the closing of gates behind them. For many, life beyond the palace was harsher than the servitude they had endured. Without family, without wealth, stripped of identity, they wandered as shadows of what they once had been. Some found themselves in the floating world of the pleasure quarters, selling what remained of their beauty to survive. Others disappeared into poverty, their names erased as though they had never existed. The cruelty of abandonment lay not only in poverty, but in memory. The same lords who had once paraded them as treasures now spoke of them with disdain, mocking the very features they once praised. The concubine who had once embodied perfection became a reminder of decay, and in the courts of power there was no place for reminders of mortality. For some, abandonment was not the end but the beginning of a slower torment. The loss of youth meant the loss of identity, for they had been valued not as men but as beauty itself. Without that beauty, they were left with nothing. Their names forgotten, their past erased, they carried the weight of memories that brought no comfort. A few tried to return to the families they had once known, but time had made them strangers. The villages that had surrendered them to the courts did not welcome them back, and even when they were recognized, the shame of what they had been silenced, any words of kindness. They lived as outcasts, reminders of a life most wished to forget. Others did not endure the slow descent. Whispers spoke of men who ended their own lives, slipping quietly into rivers or forests where no one would see them fall. Their deaths were unrecorded, their bodies left without ceremony. They vanished as they had lived, unseen, their suffering concealed by the silence of a society unwilling to acknowledge their existence. The few who survived into old age often lived in poverty, clinging to fragments of silk or jewelry as proof that once in another life they had been close to power. But the truth of their days was emptiness, for in the courts of Japan, beauty was never meant to endure, and those who once bore its burden were destined to be discarded, like ornaments that had lost their shine. Legacy of silence. History rarely spoke of them. The chronicles of emperors, shoguns and daimyos filled the scrolls, yet the lives of the concubines remained unrecorded, hidden behind the walls that once confined them. Their presence lingered only in fragments, in poems written with veiled metaphors, in paintings where youthful figures appeared as attendants, in rumors whispered by travelers who claimed to have glimpsed the truth. Silence was both their curse and their legacy. For the court, it was convenient. To erase their suffering was to preserve the image of elegance, to keep the cruelty veiled beneath the beauty of ritual. For society, it was shameful. To admit their existence was to confront the price paid for power and pleasure. And so they remained shadows in memory, figures unnamed, their stories left untold. Yet traces endured. In the ukiyo-e prints of later centuries, some saw echoes of their lives in the youthful faces of performers and courtesans. In the verses of forgotten poets, hints of sorrow emerged, lines that spoke of beauty consumed and discarded. These fragments, faint and scattered, were all that remained of lives lived in silence, voices muted by the weight of history. Their absence in the official record became its own testimony. For in the silence of the scrolls, in the omissions of the chroniclers, the truth still whispers that behind the refinement of ancient courts lay lives broken, erased and hidden from the world's gaze. Though their voices were lost, their story lingers as a mirror of power. The life of the male concubine reveals how beauty, once exalted, could become a chain, how desire, once hidden, could reshape the fate of the powerless. In their silence we hear not only their suffering, but the truth of courts that thrived on obedience and concealed cruelty behind painted screens. Theirs is a legacy of absence. No monuments mark their graves, no scrolls record their names, yet in the quiet spaces of history their presence remains, not as individuals, but as a shadow cast by the very systems that erased them. Each whisper of their existence is a reminder of the cost of power when it bends lives into shapes unrecognizable. And so their memory survives, not in triumph, but in warning. For behind every tale of elegance and refinement lies another story, one of control, humiliation, and silence. The concubines of ancient Japan endure in history not as voices but as echoes, faint and haunting. Their lives, horrific and hidden, remain a testament to the darkness that thrives when beauty becomes possession and when silence is demanded as survival.